There is a lot going on about divisiveness in our country these days. And you probably haven't been hearing a lot of good news about political polarization if you've been paying any attention at all to the media. So the media tends to focus on people at the top. And legit, they're doing a lot of divisive stuff. And you're probably hearing a lot about that, so I want to talk to you about things you might not be hearing very much about. How many of you believe in science? Oh, I love it. That's fantastic. So it's so hard to get a unanimous vote on anything these days. So I want to talk a little bit about what do we know. I want to talk about the evidence. My optimism is not based in just rosy views of the future, but I am going to tell you some really positive things that are happening. First of all, first piece of good news, we are not as divided as we think we are. And you're like, prove it. Okay, science. Let's take a look at 30 years of nationally representative data from the American National Election Study. What we see here is these are people who ask Democrats and Republicans, what do you think about these issues? And then they say, what do you think Democrats think about these issues? What do you think Republicans think about these issues? Actual views are these bars, and you can see there are bars there, and then there are these red dots and blue dots. Red dots are what people think Republicans think. Blue dots are what people think Democrats think. On every issue across 3 decades, everything from minorities to women's rights to the USSR, okay, some of this goes back a little bit, and busing, what we see is that we perceive Democrats and Republicans to be farther apart than they actually are. And you're like, yeah, but these data ended in 2008. What have you done for me lately? All right, let's look. Here's some more recent data that show that Democrats are misperceiving Republicans. When you ask Democrats, how many Republicans do you think would agree with the idea that properly controlled immigration can be good for America? Democrats are like, I don't know, maybe like 50% of Republicans would think that. No, it's more like 80%. Same thing when we look at the issue of racism still exists in America. Democrats vastly underestimate how many Republicans would agree with that. And you're like, wow, Democrats not doing a good job. Neither are Republicans. Republicans also misperceive Democrats. So when you say, how many Democrats do you think would disagree with the idea that most police are bad people? Republicans think that so many fewer Democrats would disagree with that than do. So when we look at all of these different issues, we can see that Democrats and Republicans also are completely misperceiving who people on the other side are. So Democrats think that Republicans are old, rich, evangelical Southerners, and Republicans think that Democrats are queer, godless, Black union members. It's not entirely untrue, it's just not to the extent that we think. There was this interesting study that was done by Moore and Common where they said, all right, let's do a cluster analysis. Let's bring together not only voting behavior and opinions, but also values and these indicators that say, how do we understand where people are on the political spectrum? Indeed, there are people who are on the far right, there are people who are on the far left, but most people are in what they call the exhausted majority. Okay? Most people are in the middle. And there's some interesting characteristics about this where the people in the middle actually have more accurate perceptions of the people on either side than the people on either side have about each other. Also, the more you're watching cable news, the more you are at the extremes and the less accurate your perceptions are also. So here's some data. We're not as divided as we think we are. When we think about division, we're also often thinking about ideological polarization, and that is the distance between our views. Granted, that has gotten a little bit farther apart in the last 10 or 15 years, but what has ramped up dramatically is what we call affective polarization. Affective polarization is the mistrust and the distancing that we have toward people who are on the other side of the political spectrum, such that these days, people do not want to work with, live near, or have a family member marry somebody who's in a different political party. A lot of this is because of the ideas that we have in our head about those other people. We think that they are hostile, that they're selfish, that they want bad things done to us, that they don't support democracy. Well, let's see if that's true. Oh my gosh, they are not as hostile toward us as we imagine them to be. All right, prove it. So, there was this series of studies where where they were looking at what we call meta-perceptions. That's what I think you think of me. And so they said, to Democrats, are like, what do you think Republicans think of you? How much do they dislike you? How much do they think that you are stupid? And on this scale of the evolution of humans, where do you think they think you are? They ask the same thing to Republicans about what Democrats think about them. And what we find is that across all of these measures, Democrats and Republicans overestimate by a factor of 2 how much the other side dislikes them and thinks poorly of them in terms of their intelligence. We also have a lot of concern about how much the other side wants to do us harm. Leading up to the election in November, over 70% of Americans were worried about that there would be violence in the aftermath of the election. So I found this interesting study where they said, okay, here's a scenario of politically motivated murder. Okay, someone gets killed for political reasons. How much would you find that justifiable? And how much do you think that people in the other political party would find that justifiable? And what we see is that Democrats and Republicans thought that 40%, almost 40% of people in the other party would find politically motivated murder justifiable. No wonder everyone is so nervous. Oh my gosh, if you think that they are just out to kill you and that they would be fine with that, of course we're scared. The actual number, 1 to 2%. Okay, it's not 0. It's still over 1 million Americans, but it's not the 31 million Americans that we estimate it to be, okay? They do not want to do us harm nearly as much as we think they do. We also think that people on the other side want to do things to circumvent democracy for their own means. And it turns out that they don't want to nearly as much as we think. And this is the really dangerous thing. The more we think the other side is willing to undermine democracy, the more we think our side is justified in doing that also. So our misperceptions are actually helping to undermine our democracy. Here's another piece of good news. Americans want to be part of the solution. About 70% of Americans are interested in restoring civility and finding common ground, and they want their elected officials to do that also. And around 70% of Americans also believe it's possible to find common ground on most issues. This isn't what you're hearing from the talking heads in the media. I'm not talking about the elected officials. I'm not talking about the media personalities. I'm talking about most Americans. When we are losing faith in our fellow Americans, that's what's causing the division, and that's where we need to shift our views about people. How can we do that and how can we come together? Well, there's this thing called the bridging movement. There are over 500 organizations in this country who are working on bridging divides and strengthening our democracy. You can join the bridging movement. I put up a QR code. It'll take you to a place where you can just sign the Listen First pledge that says, I will listen first to understand. It doesn't commit you to anything, although you're supposed to listen, but what it will do is send you an email every week on Listen First Friday, and it's going to tell you about what these organizations are doing. And there's fascinating stuff that people are doing that have to do with conversations and podcasts and civic engagement and advocacy and building community. National Week of Conversation is coming up later this month, and that's a great time to get involved. Also, you can go to conversation.us and find out more about it. If that's not enough, there's a lot that you can do to figure out how to navigate political division. I'm not going to go over all of this now, but it has to do with reducing polarizing input, building our individual capacity, and strengthening connections. You can read all about it in my book, Facing the Fracture. I brought a few copies in case you want to get one. If you're like, I don't want to read a whole book, do you want to do a worksheet? So I've got this worksheet about staying grounded and engaged in turbulent political times. You can get that on my website. You can also get an awful lot of other resources on my website. I put them out there because it's not what we're hearing in the news. It's not what we're seeing in our social media feeds. And we need to hear it. We need to shift our views about the other people who are in this country with us, because we are stronger together than apart, and we can come together. And that's some good news about political polarization.